choice that will define the future of a region that served as the cradle of civilization and a crucible of strife.
We begin our headlines tonight in Egypt, Israel, Jerusalem, Gaza Strip, and the West Bank, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, the Gulf States. A lion that was rescued from the abandoned zoo in Syria has given birth to a cub just hours after.
In the pursuit of a broader peace and peace with the Palestinians. And I greatly look forward to discussing this in detail with you, Mr. President.
Hi, my name is Gemma Neary and welcome to the first edition of Season 2 of The Modern Middle East. Throughout the show we'll recap the major regional events of the past year. We'll be joined by one of Australia's leading journalists, and we've got a feature travel story about a family who spent time in the UAE. But first, let's look at what's been happening in the Middle East. We begin our headlines in Iran tonight, where authorities have executed 8 Islamic State-affiliated militants after they were charged with carrying out a deadly terrorist attack in the capital of Tehran last year. The men were hanged and dozens more remain on trial for the dual assault on Iran's parliament building and a shrine of the country's founding Ayatollah. The siege killed 18 people and wounded over 50 and was the first time that the Islamic State had claimed responsibility for an attack within Iran. Amid Yemen's civil war, the United Arab Emirates has paused its military offensive aimed at capturing the rebel-occupied city of Hodeidah to allow United Nations envoy the opportunity to broker a ceasefire. Control over the port city has been highly sought after by both rebel and pro-government forces, as it's a key entry point for food and other vital supplies. Thousands of civilians have fled the city since the UAE-led assault began last month, and the UN has warned that the continuation of the conflict will only escalate the country's humanitarian crisis. A ceasefire was also reached in Syria, following an aggressive campaign by the Bashar al-Assad regime to regain control over the province of Daraa. The brokered agreement between rebels and pro-government forces will enable hundreds of thousands of citizens to return home after weeks of violence that incited one of the biggest waves of civilian displacement since the beginning of the war. The capture of the province is one in a series of recent victories for the regime, who, with Russian backing, has managed to wrangle control over large sections of the country. Staying in Syria, preliminary investigations at the site of a suspected chemical weapons attack earlier in the year have found traces of chlorine, but no evidence of a nerve agent. After video footage and witness testimonies from the attack emerged, the United States and key European allies accused the Syrian regime of carrying out the attack, while Assad repeatedly denied involvement and maintains that it was staged by rebels. The Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons emphasised that their interim findings aren't conclusive and that the investigation is still ongoing. The Turkish government has issued a decree sacking over 18,000 civil servants, including 9,000 police officers, 5,000 armed personnel and hundreds of university academics. After a failed military coup in 2016, the government has been accused of disproportionately cracking down on dissent after the dismissal of over 160,000 people accumulatively. This recent purge comes just days before the President Erdogan is sworn back into office following last month's national election. In Egypt, a Lebanese tourist has been sentenced to 8 years in jail after posting a video online in which she complained about Egypt and insulted its citizens. The video quickly went viral, and despite her efforts to take it down and to issue a second apology video, the woman was arrested at the airport before her departing flight. While defamation in Egypt is a crime, critics have noted that the incident will only further deter tourists during a time when the country is trying to attract international visitors. Plans by Israeli authorities to demolish a village belonging to a nomadic Bedouin tribe in the West Bank have been suspended, to allow time for the state to hear the village's objections. Israel considers the small village to be illegal. However, their demolition plans have sparked local protests and drawn international criticism. The Bedouin community is situated between 2 Israeli housing settlements, and their displacement would enable additional Israeli construction that would further jeopardise the Palestinian hope that the West Bank could be a part of their potential state. Lastly, the Egyptian Museum has celebrated the safe return of hundreds of ancient artefacts from Italy, which had been stolen by smugglers through illegal excavations. The relics' origins span several civilizations and historical eras, and include over 150 small statues and thousands of coins from the Greco-Roman period. The theft of antiquities has been prevalent during regional periods of political instability. However, the majority of pieces only required minor restoration and are now exhibited within the museum. Let's move on now to the focus of tonight's episode. A lot has happened in the Middle East since the beginning of our last season. Elections were held in Lebanon, Egypt, Iraq and Turkey. Domestic and international policy initiatives were rolled out, and some conflicts escalated while others showed signs of winding down. So before we go any further, let's catch up on the last year in news.
How would I describe the last year? Oh dear, these are really big questions that I need half an hour to talk about.
Strange.
Mosul. Victory over ISIS in Mosul.
In a significant international victory, the Islamic State lost their largest territory stronghold to Iraqi and Kurdish forces, backed by a United States-led coalition, after a 9-month-long offensive to liberate the city of Mosul from ISIL militants. As Yemen continued to grapple with its ongoing civil war, a Saudi Arabian-led coalition amplified its airstrike campaign against anti-government rebels, which resulted in dozens of civilian fatalities and exacerbated the existing humanitarian crisis. In a historic but controversial referendum, citizens living in the autonomous Kurdistan region of Iraq voted overwhelmingly in favour of independence. The divisive vote escalated regional tensions and triggered a military response from Baghdad, who sought to suppress the independence movement. Syria's hopes of competing in what would have been the country's first FIFA World Cup was shattered after the underdog team made it through a number of qualifying matches, but lost 2-1 to the Australian Socceroos. November was defined by two particularly devastating events. A 7.3 magnitude earthquake struck the Iran-Iraq border and left over 530 people dead and over 7,000 injured. And in the Sinai region in Egypt, suspected Islamic State militants detonated explosives and then opened fire inside a crowded mosque, which killed 305 and injured 128. At the end of 2017, President Donald Trump announced that the United States would formally recognize the contested city of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. The decision contradicted 7 decades of American foreign policy and drew worldwide criticism that it would inflame the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Widespread civilian protests against Iran's struggling economy intensified in the new year, when the regime's repression of demonstrations resulted in the death of over 20 protesters and the arrest of thousands. While in Saudi Arabia, a government-led anti-corruption crackdown produced over $106 billion in financial settlements, following the arrest of several princes and dozens of elite businessmen. The Syrian regime launched a military assault to recapture the last cities of rebel-occupied territory around the capital, which killed over 500 civilians within the first week, and dozens more during a suspected chemical weapons attack that was deployed in the following months. Violent clashes between Palestinian protesters and the Israeli Defense Force erupted at the border between Israel and the Gaza Strip, and have reoccurred weekly since the end of March. The IDF have been repeatedly accused of using disproportionate force, with the toll currently standing at 143 Palestinians killed and over 15,000 injured. In a lighter story, the international blockbuster Black Panther became the first film to be screened in Saudi Arabian cinemas in over 35 years. As part of a series of modernisation reforms that will reverse the existing ban on movie theatres and enable over 40 new cinemas to open within the next 5 years. Against domestic and foreign advice, President Trump announced that he was pulling the United States out of the Iran nuclear deal. The withdrawal unravelled years of joint diplomatic progress, isolated key European allies, and risks a potential nuclear arms race in the Middle East if the deal collapses. And in the past month alone, the Broadway musical The Band's Visit, a story underpinned with themes of understanding between Arabs and Israelis, swept the Tony Awards. Women in Saudi Arabia became eligible for driver's licenses when the regime lifted its ban on female motorists. And Jordan's Prime Minister was forced to resign after nationwide protests against a controversial tax bill.
So I think the Middle East is definitely going through an extremely delicate, important and predictable phase, and we are yet to see the outcome of that.
This is only a small snapshot of what's been a huge year in the Middle East. Many of these events are still unfolding, and luckily we've got the next 12 episodes to break it all down. We have to go to a break, but stick around as the ABC's head of investigative and in-depth journalism, John Lyons, joins us to discuss the years he spent as a foreign correspondent in the Middle East. Welcome back. Joining us from Sydney is John Lyons, the ABC's head of investigative and in-depth journalism, a former foreign correspondent in Washington, New York and Jerusalem, a 3-time Walkley Award winner and author of his recent memoir, Balcony Over Jerusalem. Thank you so much for coming on the show. That's quite a career. What made you want to be a journalist and a foreign correspondent?
In a way, one of the things that drove me to be a journalist first off was the desire to travel, basically. I was choosing between, I wanted to be a lawyer, and I got into Melbourne University to do some law, but then my career, one of the teachers at school, literally on my last day in Melbourne, just said to me, why don't you think about being a journalist? So I wrote letters off for cadetships, and 37 years later, I've had the most extraordinary career, and I absolutely love being a journalist, and I've been able to live in amazing places like the Middle East for 6 years with my family.
How did you end up based in Jerusalem, and what was that transition like for you and your family?
Well, I'd been to Jerusalem with my wife about 20 years ago, and we were quite enchanted by the city. It's a remarkable city. I think it's perhaps the most interesting city in the world because of its history, because of its different religions, its different cultures, and yes, the different tensions and conflicts that feed into it every day. Plus the wider Middle East. I'm fascinated by the Sunni and Shia battle. Iran, I went to more than once. I went to Iraq, I went to Lebanon. I mean, for a journalist, it's the most extraordinary place. So I wanted to go there. Once we'd visited and been quite enchanted by it, my aim was to go back there one day as a correspondent. So my wife and I and our son, who was then 8, went off to Jerusalem and had the most extraordinary 6-year adventure.
I'm sure. Were there any stories or places that you covered that particularly stuck with you?
I think I saw the rise and the fall of the Arab Spring. I saw the optimism of the Arab world, hoping for democracy. I saw the enthusiasm of crowds in places like Tahrir Square in Cairo. I was there when families were coming out. I saw people in Iran coming out and women putting their scarves back as a sign of revolt. And I saw, obviously the Islamic world, not just the Arab world. Yeah. And then I saw the brutal crushing of that rise and fall. That I think was really quite distressing to see so many people crushed so violently. And I lived on a daily basis in Jerusalem with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so in my book, I look at what life's actually like living in the suburbs of Jerusalem, living among Israelis and Palestinians, and seeing how they actually get on in the backyard level when someone has a barbecue and someone in the next yard doesn't like that. I saw the Israeli-Palestinian conflict really close up. And by the way, any comments I make today are not on behalf, in terms of the ABC. It's very much my time as a foreign correspondent.
Yeah. So what kind of challenges come with working as a journalist in the Middle East?
Well, the main one, of course, is security.
Yeah.
You have to really have your wits about you. It's simple things like, which driver you might get in with. You have to be making those judgments all the time. It is a very dangerous place. It's become much more dangerous. Journalists are now actively targeted. When I went there, journalists were seen as, it's great to have you here. You can bear witness to our story. As the years went on, they were actively targeted, and obviously journalists are taken hostage. The other big challenge for a journalist in the Middle East is actually establishing what the truth is, because you can be told one thing, and one thing you think is a fact, and 2 or 3 different sides, the Sunni and the Shia, will disagree that it's a fact, or the Israelis and Palestinians will say, no, that's untrue. So your challenge is to check and double check. So with my book, I tended to use sources that were only really unchallenged, that were impeccable and checked many times.
Yeah, and what inspired you to write a memoir about that part of your career?
I wanted to share my experiences, but, you know, for a journalist, of course, being able to write 100,000 words rather than, you know, on the average day I'd write 600 or 1,000. To be able to write 100,000 is like a kid in a lolly shop, you know, and you can actually... What I've tried to do is take people on a journey. We arrive as a family in Jerusalem, getting my son into his new school. So I look at it through the prism, and in a way I wanted it to be a record of our time. It forced me, it took more, you know, over 6 years to sort of get it all together. But it's this record for my son, for future generations if they're interested, as to these remarkable 6 years we had as a family. And as I say, it was an historic time. We saw the rise and the fall of the Arab Spring.
Yeah.
Historians will study that, whereas I was lucky enough to be there in Tahrir Square, seeing all of this firsthand. And I think if you don't write some of these things down, then over the years you forget them.
Yeah. In saying that, are there any experiences that you had on the ground that you wish people who don't get to see the Middle East wish that they could see? Yes.
There are the main thing I would like, you know, it's hard to communicate to people, but when you're travelling the Middle East, and as an Australian and as a journalist, I was able to go from one side to another. I was able to go from Israel to Iran, which most people can't go to both. I was able to go with the Israeli army side, the Palestinian side. I was able to go into Lebanon and spend time talking to Hezbollah about what they want to do in terms of Israel. So I had this unique perspective. And what I realised in places like Iran is that the young people in Iran are just the same as the young people in Australia. They crave freedom. And so the image of Iran is, you know, hordes of people in black chanting death to America. You do get some of them in Iran, but the majority of Iranians are like anybody. They want a normal, safe, secure life. Young people want to travel, enjoy music, go to concerts, and as they get older, they perhaps want to have families. And so I would talk to Israelis, for example, young Israelis, and they would tell me what they thought Iran was like. And then I'd talk to young Iranians in Tehran, and they would say, listen, we've really got no problem with Israel. It's just the situation with the Palestinians that's a problem. And you often felt if only these people could be in the same room together, if only these 19-year-olds could sit together somewhere, they would realise actually they're not that different. Peace wouldn't be that hard to get, as long as the people, rather than the governments, rather than the old men of Tehran, for example, were controlling the countries.
Yeah, you've had such an incredible career. Do you ever miss being a foreign correspondent in the Middle East?
Look, it's good to be home for a while, but I do miss the Middle East because, you know, it's such a huge story for a journalist. It's so interesting. There's so many interesting people. You know, you wake up one day and the newspaper will sort of say to me, you know, can you go off to Baghdad or can you go off to Beirut? I mean, how many jobs can you have that are like that? I got this amazing phone call once from my editor at The Australian who said, listen, the Islamic State fighters are about 50 kilometres from Baghdad. That's half an hour's drive. Can you get there as soon as possible? And, you know, so I'm on a plane flying into Baghdad. No one else is wanting to get in there because the most, you know, bloodthirsty terrorist group of our time is within sort of taking control of the place. And as I was coming into land at Baghdad International Airport, I was sort of thinking, so what do I actually do? If they do take over Baghdad, what's my exit plan? And, you know, you don't have any as a journalist. And so, you know, the adrenaline of that sort of story, that sort of thing, of going, you know, whether it's to Egypt or Jordan or Gaza or Turkey, Libya. I saw Colonel Gaddafi's dead body lying on the floor with a bullet in his head, and then you see all the Libyans, trying to get in to see him to prove he's dead and taking selfies with him. That's sort of, it's so raw, the Middle East. It's so unpredictable and so raw. That, I'm afraid, as great as Sydney and Australia is, it obviously doesn't have that level of conflict, fortunately.
Yeah, that's amazing. I wish we weren't, but we're running out of time and are going to have to go to a break. But thank you so much for coming on and sharing your experiences.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Balcony Over Jerusalem is currently available online and in bookstores. When we get back, we'll share some tips from travellers about the best things to see, do and eat in the United Arab Emirates. Welcome back. A lot of the content that we cover throughout the show focuses on regional politics and conflict, but we also want to spend a bit of time exploring some of the beautiful destinations and unique experiences that the Middle East has to offer. So to wrap up tonight's episode, we spoke earlier with the Gilberts, a family of 5 that packed up their life in Australia and stopped over in the United Arab Emirates during their round-the-world adventure.
I find it interesting. Difficult. I find it difficult. You learn.
This is a great plug for travelling families. It's chaotic and difficult.
We're the Gilberts. We met. We were really young. I was 18 when we got married.
Yeah, and I was 22.
I was studying Arabic. I got a scholarship after the first year for an in-country program in Syria.
Really, the Syria that we remembered was a peaceful, extremely warm, giving, and some amazing experiences and memories for us.
2 years ago, we decided to change our life and travel as part of educating our kids. And I would advise to search out some of the historical elements that it has to offer, because there's some amazing things. We went to a camel market in Al Ain and a beautiful oasis and the things that really, the richness of the Middle Eastern culture that comes through. Eating's a big part of travelling in the Middle East.
Eating should be a big part of everyone's travel to the Middle East.
I love it all. I love hummus and kebabs and the flour tea that they have. I love the markets with all the spices. I love the flavours.
Yeah.
The Middle Eastern food, it's not spicy, it's just got a lot of delicious flavours in it.
Yeah.
It's really good.
Yeah, it's all the traditional home-cooked food that's the best.
My kids loved shawarma. They ate that every day. Yeah. Okay, well, baby's asleep, but we can get the older 4. Girls, boys. What about, you were going to talk about the safari.
I was.
And we got to eat all that food. Remember all the kebabs and everything?
Yeah.
And hummus. Yeah.
And hummus.
I thought it would be a desert.
And that was it.
Yeah, just like
A desert. Just.
I kind of thought it would be a bit like, the movie Aladdin, that sort of area. Yeah.
And as we waited in the gate to catch our flight onto the United Arab Emirates to Dubai, because of our children, all fair-haired, cute little
running
kids,
around, trying to kill each other in the airport.
Yeah, there were these families of Emirati families who immediately, connected with us and want to talk about themselves and their country, and it's all because kids, it's like they break that barrier. I think sometimes people get a bit scared that the Middle East is so foreign, in that some of their traditions and their cultures to many Western countries is a bit outdated. There's no good going to a country and saying, well, I'm here now and I'll do what I want. It's more, what can I learn? What can I take away from my experiences here? And the UAE is no different.
Of all the places we travelled to around that region, Syria was our favourite. It was
absolutely.
My ultimate dream would be to be able to go there and write about my experiences and share that, so that other people can kind of, understand what an amazing, beautiful culture it is, place it is, and I would love to do that. I'd love to go there and write about it. And
Yeah.
Thank you so much to the Gilbert family for sharing their experience. Check out their blog Learning Brave to follow along with their adventures, and visit the website below for more information on travelling in the UAE. That's the end of this week's edition. Share your thoughts on anything we covered on our social media pages, and head to our YouTube channel to catch up on episode highlights from tonight and Season 1. Tune in next week when we look at the key principles and the common misconceptions around Islam. I'm Gemma Neary, thanks for watching and have a great night.